The report reached Stalin's desk on the evening of May 1, 1945, transmitted from Soviet military intelligence operating in Berlin. German radio had announced that Adolf Hitler had died fighting to the last breath against Bolshevism in the defense of Berlin against the Red Army advance. The announcement claimed Hitler had fallen heroically at his command post in the Reich Chancellery, leading German forces in the final defense of the capital. The broadcast characterized his death as heroic sacrifice in defense of European civilization against Soviet barbarism and the Asiatic hordes threatening Germany. Stalin read the announcement with immediate and profound suspicion, born of decades navigating political deception. The German radio broadcast bore all the hallmarks of propaganda carefully designed to create a heroic myth rather than report uncomfortable facts. The claim that Hitler had died fighting was almost certainly false, given what Soviet intelligence knew about the Führerbunker situation. The assertion that he had fallen defending Berlin was strategically useful for any Nazi remnants seeking to position themselves as continuing Hitler's legacy and maintaining German resistance. The entire announcement served multiple propaganda purposes, other than truthful disclosure of what had actually occurred in the bunker. Stalin's suspicion deepened as he considered the timing and circumstances surrounding the announcement. Soviet forces had surrounded Berlin completely, cutting off all escape routes. The final assault had begun days earlier, with massive artillery barrages and street-by-street combat through rubble. German resistance was collapsing rapidly across all fronts throughout the Reich. The military situation left absolutely no doubt about the inevitable outcome. But the announcement of Hitler's death came at precisely a moment when independent verification would be difficult and when confusion and uncertainty might serve remaining German purposes. The Soviet leader had learned through years of brutal political struggle and total war to trust nothing at face value, especially from enemies. Announcements from enemies required independent verification through multiple sources. Claims that served obvious propaganda purposes demanded profound skepticism and investigation. The notion that Hitler had died heroically fighting rather than committing suicide to avoid capture or fleeing to continue resistance from another location seemed transparently designed to create martyrdom mythology rather than acknowledge the reality of defeat and suicide. Stalin immediately ordered Soviet intelligence and military commanders in Berlin to find Hitler's body and establish definitively how and when he had died and under what precise circumstances. The order reflected both immediate political necessity and personal determination to know the truth. Stalin needed to know whether Hitler was truly dead or whether the announcement was elaborate cover for escape through underground tunnels. The political consequences of Hitler surviving and re-emerging to lead continued resistance or negotiate separately with Western powers were too strategically significant to accept unverified German radio announcements as truth. Soviet forces in Berlin began intensive search operations across the Reich Chancellery district. Troops securing the Reich Chancellery area received urgent orders to find Hitler's remains and locate any witnesses to his death who could provide testimony. Intelligence officers interrogated captured German personnel systematically, seeking anyone who might have information about Hitler's final days in the bunker. The search focused intensively on the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, where intelligence reports suggested Hitler had spent his final weeks isolated from reality. Initial reports from the search were fragmentary and contradictory, reflecting the chaos of the final days. Some captured German personnel claimed Hitler had committed suicide in the bunker. Others insisted he had died fighting above ground. Some suggested his body had been burned to prevent identification. Others thought he might have escaped through underground tunnels leading from the bunker complex. The confusion reflected both the chaos of Berlin's final days and the deliberate secrecy surrounding Hitler's final hours. Soviet intelligence officers discovered bodies that had been partially burned in a shell crater near the bunker entrance. The remains were badly charred, making immediate identification impossible. Dental records would be required for definitive identification. Soviet forensic teams collected the remains and began the process of comparing dental work with records captured from Hitler's dentist. Stalin received updates on the search, but withheld public confirmation of Hitler's death. The political calculation was straightforward. If Hitler was dead, and Soviet forces could prove it with physical evidence, Stalin would control the narrative about Hitler's end. If Hitler had escaped, and Soviet forces announced his death prematurely, the embarrassment when he re-emerged would be severe. Caution served Soviet interests better than hasty announcement. The Western Allies posed additional complications. British and American forces were advancing through Germany from the west. The possibility that Hitler might attempt to surrender to Western forces rather than face Soviet capture could not be dismissed. Stalin suspected that some Western leaders might prefer to take Hitler alive for propaganda purposes, or even to use him as bargaining counter in post-war negotiations. The competition between allies for control of Germany's fate extended to control of Hitler's fate. Forensic examination of the burned remains proceeded through early May. Soviet pathologists worked to identify the bodies through dental records and physical characteristics. The work was meticulous and slow. Meanwhile, rumors spread through Berlin and beyond about Hitler's fate. Some claimed he had died, others insisted he had escaped. Still others suggested elaborate conspiracy theories about body doubles and secret escapes. Stalin maintained public silence while privately pressing for definitive answers. In conversations with Soviet military commanders, he expressed skepticism about claims of Hitler's death until physical evidence could prove it beyond doubt. The skepticism was not paranoia, but calculated political judgment. Stalin understood that controlling information about Hitler's death meant controlling how the end of Nazi Germany would be remembered and interpreted. The dental identification finally provided the evidence Stalin required. The remains found in the shell crater matched Hitler's dental records. The body showed evidence of cyanide poisoning and gunshot wound. The circumstances suggested suicide rather than death in combat. The German radio announcement had been propaganda, not fact. Hitler had not died fighting, but had killed himself to avoid capture. Stalin received this confirmation with satisfaction, but continued to withhold public announcement. The political value of Hitler's verified death was too important to release hastily. Stalin wanted to consider how the information could be used most effectively in the emerging post-war competition with the Western Allies. He also wanted to ensure that Soviet intelligence had thoroughly investigated any possibility of escape or survival. Throughout May 1945, Stalin allowed uncertainty about Hitler's fate to persist publicly, while Soviet intelligence confirmed the details privately. The strategy served multiple purposes. It kept Germans uncertain about whether their former leader lived or died. It prevented the creation of immediate martyrdom mythology. It gave Soviet intelligence time to pursue any remaining Nazi leaders who might claim succession to Hitler. The verification process revealed details about Hitler's final days that confirmed Soviet intelligence assessments. Hitler had spent his final weeks in the bunker, increasingly detached from reality, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed and refusing to acknowledge the hopelessness of Germany's military situation. His suicide came after he learned of Mussolini's execution by Italian partisans, and as Soviet forces closed in on the Reich Chancellery. Stalin found grim satisfaction in the manner of Hitler's death. The Nazi leader who had proclaimed racial superiority and destiny had ended cowering in a bunker, taking his own life rather than facing the consequences of his actions. The contrast between Nazi propaganda about will and strength and the reality of Hitler's suicide in a bunker highlighted the bankruptcy of Nazi ideology in ways that Stalin appreciated. The question of what to do with Hitler's remains presented additional considerations. Stalin ordered the body retained under Soviet control rather than returned to Germans or shared with Western allies. The decision reflected determination to prevent any burial site from becoming a shrine for Nazi sympathizers. It also denied Western powers independent verification of Hitler's death, maintaining Soviet control over evidence and narrative. Stalin's public statements about Hitler's death, when they finally came, reflected careful political calculation. He initially expressed skepticism about German announcements, suggesting Hitler might have escaped. The skepticism served to undermine any attempt to create heroic mythology about Hitler's end. Later, Soviet announcements confirmed Hitler's suicide, but emphasized the cowardice of his death rather than any element that might be interpreted as tragic or heroic. The handling of Hitler's death revealed Stalin's approach to information as political weapon. Control of evidence meant control of narrative. Uncertainty served Soviet purposes better than premature clarity. The ability to shape how Hitler's death was understood and remembered was too valuable to surrender through hasty disclosure or cooperation with allies who might have different political interests. Stalin's reaction to Hitler's death was notably unemotional in private conversations. He treated it as a matter of political and military fact rather than personal triumph. The absence of celebration or gloating suggested Stalin's focus was already on post-war competition rather than wartime victory. Hitler's death removed an enemy, but did not resolve the emerging tensions between Soviet Union and Western powers over the future of Europe. The search for Hitler's remains and the verification of his death occupied significant Soviet intelligence resources through May and into June 1945. Stalin personally followed the investigation and demanded regular updates. The attention reflected his assessment that controlling the truth about Hitler's fate mattered for Soviet post-war position. Physical evidence of Hitler's death in Soviet hands meant the Soviet Union could shape historical understanding of Nazi Germany's end. Stalin's suspicion of the initial German announcement proved well-founded. Hitler had not died fighting, as the propaganda claimed. The suicide in the bunker was precisely the kind of end that Nazi ideology could not acknowledge publicly. The gap between propaganda and reality confirmed Stalin's instinct to trust nothing from enemies without verification. The manner in which Stalin learned of Hitler's death and responded to it illustrated his characteristic approach to information and power. Immediate skepticism, demand for verification, retention of control over evidence, careful consideration of political implications before public disclosure, all reflected Stalin's understanding that knowledge was power, and that controlling information meant controlling reality as others would understand it. Stalin never publicly expressed satisfaction at Hitler's death in the immediate aftermath. The defeat of Nazi Germany was treated as inevitable result of Soviet power, rather than as dramatic culmination depending on Hitler's fate. The focus shifted immediately to consolidating Soviet gains in Eastern Europe and positioning the Soviet Union for post-war competition with the West. The remains, identified as Hitler's, stayed under Soviet control for decades. Stalin ordered them moved repeatedly to prevent their location from becoming known. The determination to deny any possibility of a burial site or memorial reflected Stalin's understanding of how symbols and myths could shape political reality. Destroying the possibility of Hitler cult required destroying any physical focus for it. Stalin learned that Hitler was dead through an announcement he immediately distrusted, verified it through forensic evidence that took weeks to confirm, controlled the information to serve Soviet political interests, and used knowledge of Hitler's suicide to undermine any attempt at martyrdom mythology. The response was characteristically calculated, suspicious, and focused on political advantage rather than emotional reaction. Hitler's death meant the end of Nazi Germany, but for Stalin it meant primarily a new phase of competition in which controlling the narrative about how the war ended would shape the peace that followed. The skepticism with which Stalin received the first reports of Hitler's death, the thoroughness with which he demanded verification, and the care with which he controlled disclosure of the truth revealed his fundamental approach to power. Information was weapon, truth was political tool, and nothing could be accepted without proof that served Soviet interests. Stalin learned Hitler was dead on May 1st, 1945, but he spent weeks confirming it and years controlling what others would know about it. The manner of learning was less important than the uses to which the knowledge could be put.